Hello everyone and welcome back. It feels like high heels have a terrible reputation. They have been hated for almost as long as they've been around. They are seen as anti-feminist, anti-woman. They have stories about them being invented by men so they can be inflicted upon women, so they are hobbled and unable to literally run away. They're just so terrible, and the only reason that women wear them is so that way men think they're more attractive. At least that's the story that generally gets told. But the actual story of high heels is dramatically different. In fact, they were originally designed to be functional. And they were designed by men for men. Women just happened to pick up high heels along the way, and at some point, men stopped wearing them, and we ended up with high heels becoming almost an icon of femininity and of fashion and of frivolity. So how did we end up there? Well, to figure that out, we have to go all the way back to the beginning of heels. Now, I'm specifically going to be talking about heels in the format of the heel portion of the shoe being higher than the front, not simply elevated shoes like chopines, patins, or paducas, or any number of other elevated shoes from around the world, because those are inherently meant to be functional and keep your foot dry. They just simply raise you out of the water or out of the mud, and even in their extremes of fashion, they do still have some level of function, and those are a completely separate design. Instead, we're focusing just on that high heel. Now, first we have to go all the way back to the 10th century. And a lot of this early stuff, the best research comes from Elizabeth Semmelhack, who is the head curator at the Bodice Shoe Museum, and she is the one that has brought together a lot of this information, but I have managed to find quite a bit more to add on to the story. So headed back to that 10th century, we end up in Persia, and the very first high heels that we see are actually made for horse riding. They help keep the feet in the stirrups, keep them from sliding forward, and so they are incredibly functional. They don't, however, look terribly easy to walk in, but they are a style that seems to be prevalent outside of just horse riding. We can find examples of them worn by both men and women in all sorts of regions, not just Persia, but the Ottoman Empire and Turkey, and sort of spreading out further and further from there, and these prints show a wide variety of people wearing them. So it's clearly worn for fashion as well by the time we reach the 16th century. The spread of the high heel from there into Europe seems to be based off of both of those aspects. So first off, we can see the spread moving its way up to Serbia and eventually Hungary by way of the hussars. So they are a light cavalry group which moves to Hungary, and they work as mercenaries. So wherever they go, they take this high heel shoe for riding with them. And most notably, in the 1570s, they make their way to Poland. King Bathory is also from Hungary, and he becomes the king of Poland as well as the Commonwealth that includes Lithuania at that time. And he makes the hussars an official part of the Polish military. They become a heavy cavalry, and they are considered a pretty terrifying group. They ride into battle with giant wings and are just so dramatic in their appearance. And they continue to wear high heels through all of this. In fact, we can see King Bathory in both 1583 and 1585 wearing that type of high heel in his portraits. And in fact, high heels throughout the 17th century are consistently referred to as Polish shoes. In 1593, the University of Leiden in the Netherlands had a sort of cabinet of curiosities that they were showing akin to an early museum, and they specify that they have a pair of Polonian boots, Polish boots, which would have been riding boots that would have had a high heel. So this sort of thing was considered of interest in more Western Europe. Around the same time, Shah Abbas of Persia in 1599 sends his first diplomatic mission over to Western Europe to make a tour and to make connections. They bring, of course, all sorts of Persian attire with them, including high heels, and that spreads it as well. Though it seems throughout the 17th century, as high heels start popping up at the very turn of the century there, that they are still often referred to as Polish shoes. A French to English dictionary from 1611 specifies that Polonian shoes, high and hollow-heeled shoes essentially, were called souliers cambrés or souliers à pont-levis, roughly translating to arched shoes or bridge shoes at that point in time. And they continue to make references to Polonian or Polonese shoes for the better portion of the 17th century. So Poland is more likely to be the origin of the style in Western Europe just because they're constantly referring to it as Polish shoes. Now, even though a lot of the early adoption of high heels within Western Europe is also based around riding, one of the earliest pairs of high heels that likely exists is believed to have belonged to Queen Elizabeth, who died in 1603, and she had a pair of riding boots with high heels. Now, these are a slightly different heel shape than the earlier versions that we were looking at, but they still would have functioned much the same way. They're just perhaps a little bit easier to walk in as a heel shape. And this also shows us that both women and men were wearing high heels in Western Europe from the early beginnings of their exposure. And it's also interesting to note that the fashions of this era, right at the turn of the century, are a lot more unisex than we are likely to expect. Doublets do have a little bit of shape difference, but if you're talking about a doublet that buttons up to the neck, both men and women had that. They wore similar shoes, similar hats, similar accessories. The biggest difference is just the longer skirt versus the very full breeches. And there's not actually that huge of a difference between those. So shoes didn't really have a strong gender at that point in time. Whether they had heels or not, they were pretty much worn by everyone. They used the same range of colors and heel shapes, decor like the rosettes on the front or embroidery or cutout work. Everything is very similar. Now there is a range of styles. There's not one shape of heel. Some of them are stacked leather. Some of them are wooden shapes that would have leather pulled over them in order to hold them into place. And you'll see that in those cases the sole is sort of rounded so it carries over the entire heel breast and back underneath the heel. There's all sorts of different styles and therefore different shoemaking methods when it comes to these shoes. Now, shoemaking as a trade has been well established by this point. It is a professional trade that people know how to do, but adding something like heels into the mix would take a lot of effort. This is a whole new skill that they hadn't experimented with prior to this point. They have to come up with new techniques and new methods for this, new supplies for this. In fact, it's at this point that the heel making trade becomes its own thing as well, because putting heels, regardless of the height, onto shoes takes a lot more effort. Getting them shaped and carved, especially when we're dealing with complex curvy shapes or the wood structures that fit inside, it's not an easy thing to do. And that also would have elevated the status of these shoes as well, because they weren't going to be hardworking common shoes. These were shoes that were going to be made with a lot more time and a lot more effort into them, likely a lot more money in most of these cases. And so this is another way to show off, because this takes so much time and effort. And that is something that is important to think about as we move forward with heels. They are incredibly complex to make, and to be honest, having made so many historical shoes myself, it's really easy when you get to the heel portion to end up completely failing on a pair of shoes, and I can only imagine how many times shoemakers in the 17th century were experimenting with new techniques to end up with heels higher or more curvy, and absolutely failed, because it is not an easy process. It's a way to show off. And obviously, no one likes failure. It's something that I have dealt with a lot in shoemaking over the years, and it is not always easy, especially when I am prone to anxiety, but I am constantly working on it. That's why I am so happy that BetterHelp is the sponsor for today's video. BetterHelp is an online service that connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. You can talk to them on your phone or your computer through a phone call or a video chat or messages, which means it's not only easily accessible, but if you're like me and have a difficult schedule, it is so much easier to fit in and works with whatever you need at any given time. I'm lucky I've had a really positive relationship with therapy since I was a kid, but I move around a lot and I haven't always had consistency in my life. It's not easy to keep starting over with a new therapist every time, and I end up waiting until things are a little past difficult. Thankfully, I found BetterHelp to be an incredibly easy process. You just go to the website and answer a few questions about what sorts of things you want to cover, and in about 48 hours, you'll be connected with a therapist that has experience working with whatever you're dealing with. So I was able to say I am an overthinking overachiever who needs to work on quieting the anxiety chihuahua and be connected with someone who knows how to help with that. Let BetterHelp connect you with a therapist that can support you, all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/Nicole Rudolph or choose Nicole Rudolph during sign up and enjoy a special discount for your first month. Thanks again to BetterHelp for sponsoring this week's video. Now, it's interesting to note that despite the fact that high heels were becoming incredibly prevalent for both men and women in the 17th century, they were still not well liked. at least by everyone. Some people absolutely loved them, and it seems like it was very quickly becoming a popular option for augmenting your height as much as it was for horse riding. The earliest complaint about high heels that I've come across so far is from 1662, and it's a book on artificial beauty, which already implies that this person is not going to be fond of the variety of things that people do to change their appearance a little bit. And in it, the author talks about how both men and women, who are the type of people that really pretend to be pious and are very strict about most things, still end up adjusting their body through fancy clothes and padding and restructuring, including high-heeled shoes, in order to make them seem more handsome. But in the author's mind, this just makes them look more silly. There's also a discussion later in the book from a religious aspect, trying to understand if perhaps there is some religious issue with the idea of augmenting and changing the body with something like high heels or a high hat. But generally, the author does find in that it's not that serious of a problem. No, they don't like it, but it's not worth punishing someone over. And stories like this continue throughout the 17th century, talking about how impractical high heels are, that if you go too high, you're likely to trip and fall. But they also very often acknowledge that if you go too low, it's not quite as attractive. The foot looks a lot better in a little bit of a heel, and as long as you choose something in moderation, it's not too dangerous. However, heels are getting taller and taller through the century as shoemakers are figuring out new ways of engineering this structure, and they're also getting narrower, which means that they are getting much less practical, especially when it comes to things like mud. So some shoes from the 17th century will deal with this by way of what we call slap soles, which is a sole that's actually attached and runs the whole way under the shoe and connects the forward portion to the heel and back, giving you a nice solid structure to stand on top of. It does flip-flop in the back. It's not connected at the heel, just sits underneath of it. There are also overshoes at this time, and those will continue to be popular for much longer, simply because it allows you to slip them on and off, so that way you get to choose if you need the overshoes for that day, but they function in much the same way. It's just in a lot of cases they actually fill that in-between space with a little bit of cork to help hold onto and support the whole shoe. But heels are becoming increasingly extreme for both men and women throughout the rest of the century. Now, granted, that doesn't mean that there aren't lower options. There are plenty, especially when it comes to common functional shoes. Of course, people are not doing hard physical labor in these sorts of high heels. They are again meant for show of wealth and the fact that they didn't have to be doing anything of physical labor more than anything else. Yes, it augments the height. Yes, it can still be used for horse riding and is still regularly found on horse riding boots and shoes. So it is still being used for function. It's just also a great way to show off. But one of the really important things that will later lead to the gendering of shoes happens at the end of the century. We start to separate out men's and women's shoemaking trades. And that's because more and more often women's shoes are being made out of fabrics on top. So men's shoes are continuing to be made out of leathers, very often blackened leathers, and they are dyed and stained, and they use all sorts of other ingredients that would actually mar and permanently damage nice fabric. So women's shoes being made out of silk or wool, when it's more practical, will be very easily damaged if they're being made alongside of these blackened shoes. So gradually the two trades start to separate out, because not only do you need to keep the women's shoes cleaner, but you also need an entirely different range of skills. These uppers don't have to be made by shoemakers because they aren't out of leather. Instead, they can be made by people who just know the basic skills of hand sewing, which means that over the 18th century, we start to see a change in both men's and women's shoes, and they grow farther and farther apart because in many cases, they are being made by entirely separate parts of the trade by different people. So women's shoes do retain the heel. It changes shape over the next century. It gets a little bit broader, it goes a little bit lower, adds some curves, eventually starts to fade out as we reach towards the end of the century till it becomes a very, very small heel by the 1790s. Men's shoes just sort of deflate straight down. Their heel becomes much blockier and steadier, made out of stacked leather rather than ordering in pre-made wooden heels like the women's shoemakers had to do. So they took to just doing a few stacks of heavy sole leather instead, and that just gradually deflates as the century goes on, and they too reach a fairly flat point by the end of the century. So they end up with different methods for constructing their heels. In most common cases, they end up with different methods for constructing the shoes, the uppers. All parts of the men's shoes are much heavier and sturdier versus the women's shoes that become increasingly light and more slipper-like as they go on. So everything is diverting more and more, engendering these shoes. But lots of things change as we reach the end of the 18th century. That's when we hit the classical obsession. Now, it lasts throughout the entire 18th century, and in fact sort of corresponds with this growing idea of intellectualism. There's also a growing idea that we're going to get into more of women being the more emotional and romantic type, and men being the more cold and logical type. And that starts to play in more and more. And this intellectualism from the Enlightenment is really important at the very end of the century with that classical obsession. All of these learned men would have been learning classics throughout their entire educational process, reading anything they could get their hands on from the Greek and Roman eras, and they were pretty obsessed with it. And so it comes up in architecture and stylings of fashion and home decor. It also shows up in politics and government. This is when we end up with democracies, the French Revolution, and so many more things that are very much based off of this classical concept. And shoes are one of the many things. It means that they are looking at these old sculptures and images and they see flat shoes, they see sandals. And so that actually comes back into style. There are literal sandals from the 1790s. But more commonly, they just end up with a very flat, plain shoe. And though heels for women don't entirely go away right away, it takes really until the 1820s for them to sort of dissipate entirely. You can still find them pretty easily. More and more options for completely flat shoes are becoming the standard for women during that time. For men, they don't entirely lose their heels, however. They stick to just a few little stacked levels of a heel on the back. It is fairly small, but interestingly enough, as women's heels disappear in the 1820s, men's heels return. They end up growing their heel to roughly about an inch in a lot of cases, sometimes more, sometimes less. But they have a pretty strong angular heel that is the fashion of that era, whereas women's shoes are completely flat during that time. And when they continue the conversation about the health concerns over high heels in the 1830s and 40s, they are specifically talking about men's high heels during this time. They specifically say men's. They blame them mostly for practical things like sore feet and twisted ankles, perhaps of a really unusual gait, but the important thing here is that these concerns are directed at men until we reach the 1850s, and that is when high heels come back for women as well. There's a lot of things that sort of add up to this, but the pinnacle, the point where everything just suddenly becomes high heels again, is in 1851. And that's when the Great Exhibition takes place in London with the Crystal Palace. It's essentially the first World's Fair, and there are all these amazing exhibits showcasing all of the best and brightest from trades. And one of the trades that showcases a great deal is shoemaking. And as I mentioned before from the 17th century, putting heels on shoes can be really difficult. If it's only a couple layers of leather stacked up, it's not too bad. But the moment you start getting into over an inch, you start getting into heels that are curved and shaping or wooden and covering them. There's all sorts of tiny stitching that can go into this. It gets incredibly complex very fast. And that is the perfect thing to do if you want to show off your skill in a World's Fair. So that's what the shoemakers were doing. They put all of these gorgeous high heels in, and you can't really see much of a difference between men's shoes and women's shoes in this exhibition. That's one of the more fascinating things here. The high heel is fashionable for both and of pretty similar shape. And not only is this high heel popular for helping men augment their height, but it is also popular for helping ladies make their feet look a little bit more dainty and refined. That was already an ongoing issue throughout the earlier part of the 19th century, and women were accused of wearing shoes that were too small and too light, ending up with all sorts of illnesses from exposure, from getting wet feet. Things like consumption, tuberculosis were very commonly blamed on lightweight clothing, including lightweight shoes. I did an entire video about that recently, and really the rather nonsense way that they ended up blaming tuberculosis on fashion because they didn't know better. But they were already concerned about this, so when high heels came out and offered an alternative to wearing really lightweight shoes in order to make your foot look small while also elevating the foot, meaning that it would stay drier and warmer. The responses to high heels were actually pretty positive. So throughout the 1850s, as heels were not too terribly high, only about an inch, inch and a half, they were very fond of them. They talked at length about how these could potentially solve a lot of health problems for people. However, they do mention pretty often they are concerned that it's going to keep growing and the health benefits will be far outweighed by the risks. And that essentially is what happens. Throughout the 1860s, the heel not only grows in height, upwards of inch and a half, which is what they consider to be a very high heel. Usually these only end up being maybe 2, occasionally you can find a 2.5, but that is a pretty extreme high heel for that era. Usually it's more inch and a half to 2 inches if it's considered a high heel during this time. And that becomes a very trendy style, very curvy, what they call either French or Louis XV heel. This becomes an increasingly common option on women's shoes of this time, and flat shoes sort of fade out by the mid-1860s. Extremes, however, are a constant concern. By the late 1860s, there's actually a fad for what's called the Grecian bend, and in 1868, the newspapers are full of making fun of this. Not only are women wearing high heels, but they're also starting to add a bustle to the back of their gown, as well as a very large hairstyle. And this, in combination with all of the different aspects of fashion in the time, gives them a position that sort of leans forward and really accentuates the front and back in an awkward manner. Now, these are definitely all overly exaggerated. Odds are women didn't look exactly like this, nor did they totter around on high heels quite so awkwardly as they describe. Odds are, for the most part, it was just a different silhouette than they had seen in a long time, and it happened quite rapidly, so they weren't accustomed to things like a bustle just yet. But this is the point where they start making really crazy accusations over what high heels are doing to women's bodies. Not only are high heels blamed for the practical things that they were blamed for in the decades past, such as sprained ankles or other sorts of issues with the legs and the feet, but they also start getting blamed for things like hysteria or for infertility. They honestly thought that because the way the high heels sort of adjusted the pelvis slightly, that all of the organs inside were no longer properly supported and would start jumbling about, and you might end up with things displaced because you wore high heels, which now we know is a pretty insane concept. Our organs don't just jiggle about if we do things, but they didn't recognize that then for whatever reason, and so they literally thought that high heels could kill you, if not do all sorts of terrible things in the interim. Along with this, they come out with just constant literature telling women you need to stop wearing high heels. You are doing so much damage to yourself, you're damaging your family, you're damaging society. Think about how terrible it would be if all women were infertile because of their high heels. So they really panic over this and are very loud and vocal about it. Granted, it doesn't really result in any changes. Women's high heels go up and down and change shapes over the next few decades, but at no point do they entirely get rid of them. And you would think at some point they would find it doesn't seem to have any effect on women's bodies. They're continuing to see women live long lives all while wearing high heels. It's been decades at this point that they're still wearing them and being okay. But there's actually a secondary, more insidious thing beneath this. What they really want to do with all of this literature about how women are prone to being influenced by fashion. They are too easily controllable. They are constantly running off after something new and pretty and shiny. They aren't being practical. They aren't listening to medical advice, for goodness sakes. They cannot be trusted with their own bodies, let alone anything else. We need to make sure that they are protected, that they are guided, that they cannot make these poor decisions for themselves, because look at the clothes they are wearing. They clearly cannot make good decisions, and they directly draw a correlation between these poor decisions that women are making in fashion with the fact that women are asking for the vote. They are asking for more freedoms and more rights, and there are multiple articles that state this exact thing. One article from 1870 notes the disregard of medical advice that women often do, and says no woman who is willing to follow so absurd a fashion as this, fully cognizant of its evils, ought ever to ask the right of suffrage or to complain that she has no part in the making of laws by which she is governed. Another from 1871 says, but the dear dear creatures in their irresistible way, resented this interference with their prerogative of self-torture and self-caricature, and asked, would you have us look like dowdies with broad toes in our shoes and low heels and all that? Suffrage, right to hold office, show us first the woman who has independence and sense and taste enough to dress attractively. That was actually the New York Times, by the way. So there's this belief that women are so easily swayed by their emotions and by their interest in things like fashion that they literally do things to harm themselves and cannot be convinced otherwise. So we can't possibly let them make other decisions. This is proof that they are just too emotional. Men, at the same time, are going more and more practical and plain in their clothing because that gives them a sense of righteousness. That says that they are not controlled by such frivolous things as fashion, something that has now become a women's thing. Fashion used to be for everyone, or more so, the rich. Now it is specific to women, rich or not. So it is seen as a feminine thing, and to not be swayed by fashion, to wear practical plain clothing, is something that is seen as better than. Now, granted, men are still following fashion. They are still wearing what is considered the standard of fashion and wearing all of the correct things for all of the correct situations. But they don't see it as the same fashion. They see it as practical business attire. They see it as practical social attire. They are dressed as is appropriate for their class, for their standing in society. Women are just emotionally swayed by these clothing items instead, which of course is a rather silly concept when we view it that way, but for them that was just able to prove that men should be doing one thing and women should be doing another. They're both better at their own jobs and they shouldn't be trying to mix those. Women just aren't meant for the workplace and the practicalness of that, nor are they meant for voting or other sorts of things. So fashion becomes a really tangible way to show this. And as we move into the 20th century, it continues. I mean, we know we're still dealing with that today. We still have stereotypes of women being the ones who cannot manage their money and who end up buying silly things and going on shopping sprees. It's not men who are usually stereotyped in much the same way, regardless of what statistics show. And so this concept continues throughout the 20th century. However, high heels are kind of going in and out for both. So for women, they reach that peak in the late 1870s, but they keep coming down further and further until the 1890s. Men's shoes as well go lower and lower until the 1890s, and they're both sitting at half an inch, maybe up to an inch, fashionably during this time. However, when we hit the turn of the century, women's shoes skyrocket up. Skirts are getting shorter, they're able to show off their shoes even more, and while there are plenty of elaborate shoes throughout the 19th century, they now have a whole new silhouette, and a high heel looks really appropriate with that. So higher and higher high heels, things 2 to 3 inches are much more fashionable. Granted, everything's still available the whole way down to flat shoes, but men's shoes don't raise up quite as much. They don't end up with the same curvy, narrow heels that are becoming fashionable for women's wear. There's also sort of a throwback to the 18th century coming in the 19-teens and 20s, so they really love the curvy French heels from the 18th century as well. Men's shoes do sometimes end up with what they call high heels, and in the 1920s we see this, again in the 1960s with mod fashion, in the 1970s with the giant platform shoes, and time again, they sort of inflate and deflate just a little bit. And the reality is high heels, in terms of things being over an inch, don't really go away for men, but they tend to be larger, sturdier looking straight heels. So even things like athletic shoes are often an inch or more in terms of the height that it raises. Men's dress shoes or cowboy boots, the thing that is still relying on heels to work for horse riding and keeping feet in the stirrups, those heels are very often well over an inch. And for practical reasons, they never lose those, but they aren't considered feminine for that style of heel. It becomes this sturdy, blocky, functional heel that may elevate the wearer and make them taller, but isn't seen as delicate and curvy and feminine like women's shoes become. So the heels for women's shoes are not so much just getting higher, but they're getting thinner. We end up with the stiletto heel as of the 1940s, and there are a lot of really high narrow heels well before that. I also did a whole video on the stiletto heel if you want to see more of that history, but that's what becomes the feminine type of high heel. That's what becomes associated with poor decisions. Even if it's only 2-3 inches tall, which there are plenty of men's shoes that are as well, it's seen as impractical if the heel shape is not of that strong, sturdy type. And that's what we start seeing as fashion, as frivolous, as pointless outside of being sexy. Whereas men's shoes are allowed to have purpose with making them taller, making them more powerful and more impressive. Women's shoes are just there to please others, supposedly. Now, of course, if you actually go around and ask most women why they wear high heels, it's for much the same reason that men do. It's because it makes them taller, it gives them more presence, or simply because of fashion. It works well with the silhouette of the outfit that they have. So as skirts and pants change shape, women's shoes go up and down, heels go in and out, and it trends with the silhouette. But because fashion is seen as feminine and silly, we tend to think of that as just another reflection of it. So men never really stopped wearing high heels. They just felt like their reasons for wearing high heels were valid reasons for wearing high heels. And generally, even in the references such as the 1920s and the 1950s of high heels coming back for men, they don't say we're concerned about looking too feminine. They say we're concerned if they get too high, it will be difficult to walk in. I want the height, but I don't want the discomfort. Not, I'm worried about looking like a woman. So essentially, once we hit that late 17th century point and men's and women's shoemaking became two separate trades and went on two different journeys, the size and the shape, the curves of women's heels came to define them and came to be a scapegoat in the 19th century, along with the idea that women are just more prone to silly and pointless fashions than men are. And we still often believe that today. So that's how men stopped wearing high heels, and women ended up being stereotyped with them.